This has been an awesome, awesome conference. And if I'm a little bit emotional, it's because I have never given my testimony to anybody. The people who I minister to, they know a little bit about me, but they don't know everything about me. And the name of my, it says The Lion Beside Me. That is why I have a picture here that beautiful Mary drew for me. And also, too, a mirror. But this journey for me and my lion, I walked through forgiveness, redemption, and restoration. Now, some of you, I need to let you know, some of my story is going to shock a lot of you, but it is what it is. It's how Jesus Christ redeemed me after all this time. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was, I'm 70 years old. I was born in 1953. I come from a family I'm the oldest of 8 children, and I was raised Catholic. And when I mean Catholic, I was raised a devout Catholic. I didn't date any boys unless they were Catholic. My father took me to church with him every Sunday. And a lot of my foundation, my Christian foundation, really truly came from my father and from the Catholic Church, because it opened my door. Not every door, but it did open a door for me, for who I am as a person today. A little fun fact about me, when I was 5 years old, I was a Navy brat. My father was in the Navy. And so we lived in a place called Rhode Island. And during the Camelot time, John F. K. and his wife Jacqueline, they came to the cathedral. So my dad got me all dressed up. I remember this day because I had an itchy yellow dress on that my mother made me wear. And I had these ringlets coming out of my head, and I had this big white bow stuck in my head. So, and I had white patent leather shoes, and I can remember that we went outside because my dad had to see the Kennedys and Jacqueline Kennedy. And my father had me up front where this whole gate was at. And so she walked by me, and she came back around. And there was all these men. I remember these men like in dark suits. And she reached down, and she picked me up, and she hugged me, and she told my dad, she goes, "That is the prettiest little girl I've seen for a long time." Well, you thought my father, the Pope himself, came to visit me. But it was JFK and Jacqueline. And that's a little bit of a fact about me. Another fact about me you guys would never guess, but I used to be a surfer because we lived in Pensacola, Florida. So I learned how to surf. I know I couldn't do it now because I would be pretty much like a beach whale out there. Would not be a pretty sight. I'm telling you right now, just would not be. I am going to start off with, I married my first husband, and we met in 1970. My father was a chief in the military, and our last duty station was called Oak Harbor, Washington. And I met this young man. His name was Herb Heeman, and he came from a military family himself. And the things that we had in common was the fact I was the oldest of 8 children, and he was the oldest son of a family that had 7 children. So, and we were both Catholic. The only difference was his father was a commander in the Navy. My father was a chief. And back in those days, social interaction, status mattered. So when this young man dated me, it did not go over well with his family at all. They thought my parents, he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and he was. I mean, his father was very wealthy. His father was very much into politics. And the reason I'm telling you this is because his father played a big part in the struggles of my life. I was a very obedient daughter growing up, and I mean obedient. I mean, I didn't cross any lines or nothing with my father because he was very strict. And me being the oldest girl, let me tell you something. I better walk that line or I was going to be in big trouble. So Herbie and I, we dated each other as parents. I think the reason Herbie dated me was because the fact was I was something his parents did not want him to date. They already had a girl planned for him to date. They already had a college he had to go to. And Herb was just a rebellious young man who wanted his own life. But his father had other plans. So we started dating. And he was the best guy I ever dated. I can honestly tell you, he was the greatest guy I ever dated. But he was the worst one I could have ever married for myself. In 1975, September, we got married. And it was a big, huge Catholic wedding. When I mean Catholic, I had 2 Catholic priests. Yeah, it was a big wedding. You thought I had married into a Kennedy family almost. We had, and back in the day in 1975, I mean, I had 250 people at my wedding. So I'm standing outside. Now, fathers are pretty amazing. My dad goes, we're outside. I'm in my wedding dress. People are driving by, they're honking, oh, you look beautiful. Yeah. And I got married in St. John at an old Spanish church that my family all went to. And I'm standing outside with my dad. And he looks at me and he goes, let's not do this. And I go, what? He goes, let's not do this. He goes, and he said, let's just call it a day, go home, have a party. I looked at him like, are you nuts? Like, I'm in a dress, I'm out here, people, you know what? I mean, we got it all paid. And we go into the church, and I'm standing at the pew, I'm going about ready to walk down the aisle. And he goes, and both my parents gave me away, my father and my mother did. My dad looks at me, and he grabs me, grabs my hand, he goes, Sin. He goes, let's not do this. He goes, let's just not do this. And I touched him, and I remember I said, Dad, it's going to be okay. Like I thought, did you lose your mind? What are you doing here? And we get halfway down the pew because there's separation in this church, before I got down to the main altar, because I got married inside the altar of the Catholic Church, and that is very sacred, very sacred. And my father stopped me one more time. He goes, please let not do this. He goes, this is a bad idea. He goes, I'm just telling you, this is not right. And my mother says, Brian, leave her alone. My parents are talking, and I'm in the middle with the dress on, holding these flowers. And my mom goes, Brian, be quiet. Let this girl get married, And then my dad says, I'm just telling you, it's a bad idea. And then everybody's looking at me, and everybody's kind of like waiting, and the music he's playing and playing and playing for me to walk down. And I have both my parents telling me this, my mom's saying, get married. My dad's saying, don't get married. I end up getting married. So we had a great wedding. It was really fun. My wedding was 2.5 hours long. I'm telling you, I had a Catholic wedding. I was married. You betcha. In the Catholic Church, that was it. I was married. And how many of you are Catholic or ever been Catholic? Okay, so there are two types of sin. There's mortal sin and there's a venial sin. Well, if I had divorced Herbie, I was going to go to hell because it was a mortal sin. Ask your husband. He should know this. So we got married, had a great honeymoon. I had a wonderful honeymoon with this person. And then when we got back, he went off into the Army, and he went to boot camp. And when he came back in December, because he also had to go, he decided to become a medic, and he had high enough scores to become a medic. And so I saw him again from September 16th until the 12th of December. I didn't see him at all. And then I saw him when he came home, because he was going home for 2 weeks, and then he was going to be shipped out to Germany. So we had, it was nice. I mean, I enjoyed cooking for him and everything else. Well, I'm going through a duffel bag, and I come across a letter from our best man who tells me my husband has slept with a lot of women. And I was like, okay, this is not a good thing, and I thought, all right, you know what, it happens, I went and talked to my mother. My mom goes, Cindy, this does happen in marriage, and stuff like that. And she said, you just have to forgive. And I thought, okay, it's my mother, all right. She's a Navy wife, okay, we get this, what it's like to be in the military and Army. So he goes off to Germany, and then I, of course, get pregnant in December, and I'm pregnant with our first child, and I see him, and I'm 4 months pregnant when I see him in Germany. I come off the plane, and he looks at me, and he goes, what did you do to yourself? And I said, I'm pregnant. He goes, you look disgusting. And I said, what? And he goes, he did not hug me, he did not kiss me, or nothing. And and a friend of his took us to our apartment. And for the first 8 months of my pregnancy, when I was there, I got there in April. And then April till September, I say that in August, he never talked to me, he never touched me. He was good in front of other people, but he did not acknowledge me in private. And I'll tell you something, that does something to a woman, I still prayed every day. And I prayed for God to change this man. And I prayed for my marriage. I was a devout Catholic. I mean, nothing was going to change that. And then in 1979, I was in August. I take that back, sorry. Yeah, 1976 in August, we got into a huge fight. And, he clearly was not happy with me as a wife. I didn't do anything right, could not do anything right by his words. He got more further into drugs, and he got into hashish. He got into taking heroin. I mean, it was just like a whirlwind for me. And he kicked me out of the house because I discussed him so much he could not stand to look at me. So I spent a night in Germany in a stairwell, and for a whole night long, he would not let me in. And I didn't want to make a scene because I am ashamed that my husband does not like me at all. And the next day, he let me in, and then he went to work. And this continued on for for at least a year. I had my son, Jason, and Jason was born. He was born in 1976. He was a bicentennial baby, September 30th. And my parents actually were there, and they came to see me. And I was blessed when they came because he wasn't around as much, but he was really good because my father would have said something. But see, you know what? When you are an abused woman, you hide your secret. When you're abused woman, you don't want to tell people that you made a mistake. And I was not going to tell my father I made a mistake because I was afraid he'd tell me, I told you so. So Herbie and I lived, I was in Germany we were in Stuttgart for 2 years. And then the first physical abuse took place in 1979. I was 6.5 months pregnant, and we had gotten into a really bad fight. And he beat me up, and he threw me on a rocking chair. And I lost the baby. I was 6 months along. I picked the baby up myself and brought it into the emergency room. And I can remember this today, holding it in my hand. It was so little. It was so small. And it was fully, developed. It just didn't have weight on it. And I stayed in the hospital for 2 days. I didn't tell anybody how I miscarried. I kept it, again, secrets. You keep it to yourself, because I don't want anybody to know what is going on in my life, my private life. So in the outward world, I was a sweet, pleasant young lady, and he was induced with drugs, alcohol, and he just went into a no man's land with himself. And when we came back, and then in after that happened, my husband got into dealing drugs, and it was a drug deal that went very bad, and he came home, and Jason he was like almost a year old. He was in my arms, and this man, I opened the door, and this guy comes in the house, pulls a .45 at my head, and says, "You tell your husband I need the money. I need some drugs." And as he's doing that, a young man that I became known and a very good friend of mine, he came in, and he saved my son and I, because that man would have shot me. You have to give me a moment here. Just give me a second. Then I had wrote all this. I had a lot of pages, but God told me, take it out. And I thought, okay, I'll do this. Then when and I was really afraid to get pregnant. We had moved to Nuremberg at that point. I lived in Germany for 6.5 years. So we moved in 1981. I was pregnant with Jennifer. And that's my daughter right there, Jennifer. And and I had a very tough pregnancy with her because she wasn't moving a lot. And when I went in for a visit, they told me that they said, "I think your baby's dead." And I thought, not again. Like, what am I doing wrong here? What is wrong with me? And a lot of it had to do with stress. A lot of it had to do with, with the beatings that were taking place and hiding. It just was too much. And so I went to see the military doctor told me, he says, you know what, he goes, I think your baby's dead. We need to have an ultrasound done. He said, because we'll have to induce you. And I'm about almost going to my 7th month. And I went to see this really sweet German man. And he saw bruises on me, and he said, you know what? He said, he did an ultrasound. He said, you need to look. He goes, your baby's alive. Your baby's. He said, you can have a baby coming. He goes, it's a girl. And I said, a girl? He goes, yeah. And I said, I didn't want to know what it was going to be. I wanted to be surprised. With Herb, for some reason, he was just a young man that was totally lost, and he really was. And he really did get into dealing drugs. He was out in the field for 6 weeks, and this was December of 1981. And this is how his father played a big part in this. There was a huge drug deal that my husband was going to do, and I mean, it was millions of dollars. And he had a young man that he knew named Hans, and he was a German national. He came to my house, my apartment, and him and Herb were talking about this great big deal because Herbie always wanted to be like a cartel and make money. That's all he thought about was making money. Even though he came from a wealthy family, he just wanted to make money. And so they made this deal, and he goes off plays Army for 6 weeks out in the field because they do this. He comes back, and he comes in the house, and he says, hey, he goes, has Hans been around? I said, no. And he says, you know what? He said, I have to go see him. I go, why? And he said, because he said, I'm in big trouble. He goes, either I have to have the drugs or I have to have the money. And I told him, I said, you know what? Let this go. Please let this go. Just let it go. And he said, you know what? He said, I can't. He said, I'm in big trouble. So this is very embarrassing for me because it's a part of who I was and a part of things that I was. And for me to admit a lot of things, I have to tell you, I'm not that person. But I was that person back then. And for me to share my life, it is very hard. First of all, because my daughter is here and everything else. But also, I had a lot of pain in my life. So he goes away and he comes back home. And I said, hey, did you see Hans? He goes, no. He said, I'm going to go to bed. I'm really tired. He goes, you know what, I need to rest. I said, okay. So he goes into the bedroom, goes to sleep. I put my son to bed, Jason. And I walk around the corner because I'm taking a bath. And all of a sudden, the Polizei come, and they knock on. I hear all this motion coming up to my steps, up to my stairwell. And I hear this knock and all this commotion. I hear dogs barking. And I put a towel around me because I'm about ready to take a shower. And I am 7 months pregnant, naked with a towel around me. And I open my door, and there's this military police, and he said, hey, is Spec Herb in here? And I said, no. I go, yeah, he is. I go, but he's in bed, asleep. And they said, we need to see him. They said, because we're going to arrest him for first-degree murder. So I said, give me a moment, because the young man knows that I am, and I walk back down my hallway. As I turned the corner, machine guns went off, my front door flew down, and in walked in the Polizei, the German dogs, and the police. And they arrested my husband. They allowed me to get dressed, because they're looking for drugs, see. And they searched my whole house. The only thing they took from my apartment in my house was my prenatal drugs. That's what they're looking for. I go, they're prenatal, but you can take them and have them looked at. They're just, vitamins because I'm pregnant. And so I go down to the Polizei station, and I am cavity search. I am, yes. I have a spotlight on me, and they're asking me questions because they have all these people and all these photographs. And I knew who this person was because he was Hans, and I didn't know who this person was, and this person right here, he was a president of a very big, huge company. This was not a small drug deal. This was a big drug deal. After they let me go, because they realized they couldn't find anything in my apartment, and they wouldn't have. And my prenatal vitamins were real prenatal vitamins. And then they took me back home. And I get a call from the commander of the military. in Nuremberg and said that, not only did your husband, he said, this is what happened. He goes, your husband goes to this young man's Hans's house, and he goes, and he wasn't there, but his girlfriend was. And she was, Herb approached her, because the people in the stairwells could hear an argument going on between a man and a woman. She walks outside to the balcony, and she's sitting on a corner like this. And Herbie goes up to her and says, either give me the drugs, he says, and you tell Hans I need it, or the money. And he touches her. He walks back into the apartment. He turns around to say something to her, and this girl falls 16 floors to her death. And so instead of staying, he gets in his car and he comes home, and that's how I end and all that. His father, and he was looking at, not only did he do that, but he also sold guns to East German. So he was in a lot of trouble. He was looking at life in prison at Leavenworth. And his father called in favors from Senator Hart and Senator Goldwater. And he got away with a slap on his hand. And he got all his full benefits for the military. And it pretty much like it never happened. And so when I mean that his father was powerful, he was a powerful man. He really was. And his son could do no wrong. And I was the cause for the destruction in his son's life. Because if he had not married me and married somebody above his station like he should have, this would have never happened. That is not true. But back then, I believed it. I need to tell you, I actually believed what this man was telling me was true. Then I got home. I didn't see her when he got out of jail. I went home because they flew me home within 2 days. Went home, and I have to tell you, I was leaving when I got home. My family was there. I went into, labor, and I had Jennifer. And then he comes back, and he's out of the Army. And then his father said, I want you guys to come to Colorado. And I think being in Germany led to the prelude of what really took happen in Colorado Springs, because that's where everything got horrific. And that's where everything got torn apart. That's where everything that I thought was going to be my life totally did not turn out the way I wanted it to. So we go to Germany. So we go back home to Colorado, and his dad pays for us to go to Colorado. And we go and we live with his parents for a couple months, and then his dad ends up getting a heart attack. And then, of course, we had to move out. Now, she is 6 months old, and I had to find a job because his parents told me I have to work because Herb could not hold down a job because now, he was drunk at every job he did. And I think when that girl died, and I think the trouble he got into, I think more importantly when that female died, it did something to him mentally. I do not believe that he ever recovered from that because that's when the alcoholism really began in life with him. And it's a sadness because he is a human being, and it was a sad that this happened to this man. But in I gotta take off my glasses now because now I can't see. The abuse really started when we moved into our bungalow house. I have to tell you, when I lived in Colorado Springs, we have moved. I was there from 1982 to 1987 is when we lived. We lived in 9 different homes. My son went to 9 different schools. I worked 3 jobs, and I worked graveyard at 7-Eleven, got off graveyard, I delivered newspapers, had a newspaper job. And I could tell you, in my car, I could chuck that newspaper over, and it would land right on that porch of that person. And then I worked for a tanning salon, so sleep was not an option. I couldn't sleep because I had to work, I had to provide, and he just could not hold down a job. And his alcoholism got more and more increased and more bad. I was hospitalized 3 times. I was in 3 women's shelters, and I called police numerous times. He almost died twice. And then I think the turning point for me was when it was in It was April of 1986. And, I'll take that, 1985. We were living in our last apartment. I was working graveyard. I no longer had the paper out because I was working so many hours at 7-Eleven on graveyard. So, and I was trying to sleep, and my husband kept waking me up every 20 minutes because, see, I knew he had a pattern. I knew he wanted to fight. I knew that I was going to be beaten, and I knew that I'd have to go to work, hide my bruises, everything else. So that night, my son and him, and my daughter was probably, I would say you're probably like about 4 maybe, I'm thinking, about 4 years old. And Herb, I was laying perfectly still, and he kept coming up, like I said, every 20 minutes waking me up because he wanted to fight. And this one time he came up, he had my son with him. And my son was in 5th grade at the time, and I remember laying perfectly still in the bed. And my husband comes up, and he has my son with him, and he says, and I could see, and I had my eyes, I knew what was going on because I had my eyes like split open what was going on, and my son had a huge knife in his hand. And he told my husband said, I want you to show me the right way to kill somebody. And my son goes, I don't want to do this, Daddy. He goes, you show me the right way to kill somebody. And he was pulling my son, and he was hitting him, and Jason goes, okay, I will do this, Daddy. And he said, you want to go down? And he says, you want to go down or you want to go up? He goes, that's how you kill. He said, repeat it. And my son was crying. He's shaking. He goes, you want to go down and up. He goes, that's how you really kill somebody. And I laid perfectly still because I know. And I could feel the blade on my stomach. And I just said, please don't let this boy kill me. Please do not let this little boy kill me. And I remember when I got up and I looked in the mirror, everything that happened in my life, everything, all came to a halt. And I no longer saw myself anymore because there was pain, there was guilt, there was shame. I was unworthy. There was no hope for me because I was nothing. I was lost. I was rejected. The guilt for my children overwhelmed me. Shame, unworthiness, unlovable. I was fat. I was ugly. You're a disgusting human being, Cindy. You're useless. You're not wanted. Nobody will ever want you. Not desirable. I was morally bankrupt. That's a hard word, morally bankrupt. Not a good mother. You never amount to anything. You could be a better wife. It's all your fault that my son is not accomplished. You bring humility, you bring destruction to the family. You need to work harder so my son doesn't have to. You're cursed. You're a bitch. You're a murderer. You see, I murdered that baby. He let me know that I murdered that baby that was inside me. He never let me forget that I murdered that baby that was inside of me. And unworthiness. I'm not loving enough. And it goes on and on. All the pain, everything came to rage that night in me. And there was nothing looking back at me. I no longer saw myself. I saw nothing. I felt nothing. I was dead. I was exactly what he said. I was dead. And when I look back, there was nothing staring at me anymore. There was nothing. I had no humanity in me anymore. I had no love anymore. I mean, my children were hurting, and yet I didn't have the empathy to do anything to help them. And he was right about some things. I allowed some man tell me that he was right. And I go to work that night, and I am mad, and I'm angry, and I am destroyed. Because I was saved the fact that boy didn't kill me. What happens if he would have killed me? There would have been no hope for anything. Well, I worked in 7-Eleven. I had very we'll just say very colorful people come to the store. I was very well known. I was the only one that worked graveyard. The cops knew me by name. And in walks this young man at 2 o'clock in the morning. Now, I have to tell you, I don't feel anything. Like I am dead. Like there ain't nothing left. This young man comes in, and his name was TJ. I'll never forget him. He just got out of prison for 2 years. I'll tell you right now, he came to the wrong store that night. He bought all these. Back in the day, they had this medication called Allerist. Anybody ever heard of this medication called Allerist? Well, it was, yeah. So he bought all 10 packs. And he said, can I use the bathroom? I said, sure, because back in the day when you worked at 7-Eleven and they had gas stations, they had to be able to use the restroom. I said, sure. So he comes out, and he hands me a note, and it reads it, and it says, please call 911. He said, because I'm trying to kill myself. I gave him back it, and I said, well, it's your lucky day, because I'm going to let you die. And he looked at me. He said, no, you have to call. I said, I don't have to do anything. You want to die? I'm going to let you die, because I really don't care. And he looked at me, and he said, you have to. I go, no. I go, you need to leave my store, because you ain't going to be dying here on this store. I just waxed my floor, and you need to leave. And this boy runs outside. I said, because I'm not giving you mouth-to-mouth, because I have no clue where your mouth has been for 2 years. I ain't doing this. So he goes outside, and I am just, nothing's coming out of me. And he's looking at me, and he runs out in the street, and he is screaming bloody murder. I'm outside sweeping the sidewalk and going to clean it and washing the windows outside, and he's going, help me. He goes, there's a crazy lady in that store. And he goes, and nobody, and he's trying to stop cars, and people just run right by this guy. And so about 2 hours later, the police officer, who I knew really well, they said, this young man is in the hospital. He said, the minute he said there was a woman, we already knew it was you. He goes, well, you're really going to let this man die? And I go, yes. He wanted to die. Who am I to stop him? He wants to die, let him die. And so and believe it or not, that young man comes back 2 weeks later on my graveyard shift. And he says, I have to thank you. He said, never want to live so much in my life. He said, when you honestly said you would let me die. He said, because I realized at that moment I wanted to live, that there was somebody that didn't care if I lived or died. And you know what? And if he had known, like years later, I figured out it was Jesus who saved him, not me. Jesus did. Jesus happened to use my nutness to go, well, you know what? Let him run down the street, you know. It's okay. It's all good. 3 weeks later after that incident happened, I got promoted to manager of 7-Eleven. So I know, and I thought, okay, well, you know what? My husband beats me up. You know what? Hey, I almost died, but here I get a promotion. I get to have my own store. So we moved to Cascade, my kids and I did, and I did make really good money. But that is where things got horrible. And as I exceeded to be more successful, my husband got into more and more darkness. And in fact, he was known as a neighborhood drunk. And my workers knew who he was, but the corporate did not know who he was. So he would come up there when I had these inspections going on in the store, and you know, he would disable my whole car. Like there'd be tires going down the street. And I would just look at him, you know, and they'd say, do we need to call the cops? And I go, no, he's harmless. I go, he's just a neighborhood drunk, but he was my husband. No one knew this man was my husband. I didn't tell anybody he was my husband. Because I needed to, you know, work. I needed to make a job, and I did not want to lose my job. You know what? And we did have a beautiful house in Colorado. It was gorgeous. But the beatings got worse and worse. And the chaos in my house. Now, you want to talk about heroin and about drugs. There ain't no better, more stronger drug than chaos in your life, because it's addicting. You can't live in a normal life because, man, that chaos is calling you. And I was an alcoholic, but not really an alcoholic, on a drug called chaos. And I was hooked. And there was nothing you could tell me that would ever change that. Because, see, I hid my bruises. I hid my lies. I made everybody think that my husband was a businessman that was away on trips. And that's not true. He was the man outside undoing my undoing the cars. He would assemble my whole car. And my workers would go out there, they go, no, we will take care of the city. They go right down to get my tires, put my tires on my car. He would undo the battery, they put the battery back on. A lot of, it was just crazy with him, just crazy. And then after that, and I really, truly, there is a fine line between sanity and insane. And I can tell you, I was walking that. During the day, I was a successful businesswoman, and I was. But at nighttime, the minute I left that store, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and my house was just around the corner, I became unworthy. I just became a nothing. I could hear my children cry because they would wait for me on top of the mountain until I got home. And then they would come home because I was there. But it didn't do them any good because I couldn't even help myself. In 1985, it was a pinnacle time in my life. I was working, and I got up in the morning, and the crazy thing, I had an amazing grandmother. She calls me, and I'm at work. And she says, this is 1987, and this is March 25th. My grandmother calls me. And she goes, Cinder Lou, she goes, how are you? And I said, Grandma? And she said, yeah. I go, well, how did you get this number? She says, I have ways. And I said, ways? And she said, yeah. And she said, I was just thinking about you. I just had a call to talk to you. And so I talked to her. And unbeknownst to me, she got a word from the Lord. And the Lord told her, you get her home. Because if you do not get her home, you will never see her again because she will die. The Cindy you know will die because she can't do this anymore. And I didn't know any of this. And so I go back home, and then on the next day, the 26th, after work, I walk up and I see this church. It's a rundown Catholic church. Nobody's there, and I walk in it because I am in actually despair. And I can remember going to this church, and I remember that there was like holes in the ceiling, and there was ivy going everywhere. And I can see, like there was a sunlight coming in. And I got on my knees, and I said, help me. I am so lost. I don't know what to do anymore. And there is no one to help me, no one. Like his parents would not help me because, see, it's my fault. And I can remember after, just talking and just praying. But see, at that point, I didn't think God was even listening. I didn't understand what it was for God to listen to me. I didn't even know who really Jesus was at that point. Even though I was a Catholic, a devout Catholic, I did not understand a lot of things. And I was walking home from the chapel. I could go around the corner, and I was just saying, please. I could not stop the yelling of my children were crying. I could hear them crying, and I could not stop them from crying. They were saying, help me. Someone help me. Because I knew when I walked home, there was going to be a huge fight. My son would be beaten. I would be beaten. And the only person that my husband never touched, really, truly, was Jennifer. Because most abusers have to have somebody to love them. In this case, it was Jennifer. And so the next day, I can remember, on that same day, I go home and we have the biggest fight ever. And he came after me. Jason ran off to call the police to have him arrested again. And it's the first time that she never left, because usually when I would try to leave, she would always stay with her father. And this time, because he yanked her arm, she had broken her arm, and he had yanked her arm, he hurt her, and she stayed with me. And then he takes off. And I can remember standing there, and there was sunlight, and there was wind, just a light wind. And I heard a voice say, just leave, just leave. And I knew in the moment that who was telling me to leave. I have heard God's voice, audio, actual physical voice, 3 times in my life. This was the first time. And the next day, that night, we couldn't find a place I couldn't stay home. The police told me I had to go find a place to stay. I didn't have any money. So I, luckily, with the help of my grandmother, she got me a hotel room, and I stayed the night in the hotel room. The next day I got up. Now the crazy thing when I left Colorado, I had an iron, don't ask me why. She had her clown blankie, and my son had his bear called Boo Boo. And so Boo Boo and us and my iron, we all went to work. And luckily the kids missed their bus. And out of the blue, the next day, I see this 27th, it's March 27th, 1987. I see my brother and sister pull up in Colorado Springs. And I'm like, what's going on? And they said, hey, we come to take you home. And I said, and even, this is how sick I was. I said, you can take the kids home, but I need to stay. And they said, no, you know what? Why don't you come with us? Just come. They had to talk me out of the store. They had to talk me into the car. They had to talk me to the airport. They had to talk me to walk down that plank, to get into the plane. And they had to talk me to sit on that plane. Because, see, chaos ruled my life. This was not normal. Like, I won't be able to function. I go home. Never went back to Colorado again. I never lived there again. I had to go back for my divorce. But the minute I got back to counseling, I went to a counselor. And I didn't choose a Catholic counselor. I chose a Christian counselor. And it was a man. And I have to tell you right now, I did not like men. Had no use for them. Sorry. Did not like them. Just couldn't like them. I couldn't see the purpose of them or nothing. I knew I had to have them to have my children. But other than that, that was it. And the counselor made me first of all, he made me write my story out, and I did. And then he made me take a psychological test. And when he brought back the test, he says, he goes, what do you think this test said about you? And I said, that I'm a victim, that I was beaten, that, pity Cindy and everything else. He said, no. He said, you have criminal tendencies. And I said, oh, no, I don't. He said, yes, you do. And I said, no, I don't. And he said, yes, you do. And then he broke it down for me. He said, you justified him doing drugs. You justified him dealing drugs. You could justify him being abusive to your children. You could justify him beating you. You have the same tendencies as he did, but you're not the alcoholic. You're not the drug addict. He said, you're a sober alcoholic and you're a sober drug addict. Well, let me tell you something. That Cindy, the old one that was very long from that person being abused, she was just like, you are absolutely wrong. He said, no, I'm right. So I was in therapy for 2.5 years, and it was very intense therapy. I used to go see him 3 to 4 times a week. I was very sick. I mean, mentally sick, like really mentally ill. And then we went to counseling, and then, life seemed to be better. And I started to get more healthier thinking. 4 months later, he made me take the test again. And my answers were like night and day. I saw things more clearly. I wasn't afraid when my phone rang at home because he wasn't, I could handle her be calling me. I could say, you know what? Because he'd say, I'm going to kill myself. I go, well, you know what? You need to get life insurance if you're going to kill yourself because you have 2 children that need money. So I got bold. You know what I'm saying? There is a boldness in me that just started coming. I've always been, but when you get beaten down so much, that boldness goes away. It no longer occurs to you. It's no longer there anymore because you become a nothing. So then we had to walk through some things. And one of the things we had to walk through was my healing. And that, I have to tell you, was kind of hard because you have to look at oneself. When you look at oneself, you have to realize what's looking back at you. The first thing we had to go to, and first thing he had to work with me, he said, let's talk about healing. He said, let's talk about, not healing, let's talk about forgiveness. And he says, forgiveness oneself is asking for forgiveness and forgiving those that hurt you. Forgiveness is one of the hardest things you have to do in your journey to growth and peace. Forgiving yourselves is one of the hardest things you always have to do in your life. Because, see, I had to look at myself, and I had to own what I did. He was right. I allowed things to happen to my children that should never have happened. I should have, should have left. I did try to leave several times, but my daughter just would not go, and I was not going to leave her there. But I had to own my stuff that I did in that relationship. I owned it. Who in their right mind would let their children be beaten by a man? Who in their right mind would allow somebody to beat you, and to manipulate you and to destroy you? I allowed somebody to come into my life to destroy me as a person, as a human being, and I was a something, and I had to learn that. And so when I found, so if you go to Philippians 3:13, and the first thing I had to do in my step of recovery is the fact is I had to forgive myself. And it says here, I better get my glasses on. Before I could count myself, apprehend, but this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind. And that was important for me to try to understand that and reaching forth unto those things which are before. That is important. I had to look at myself and realize it's okay. Own it, accept it, but forgive yourself so you can move forward in your healing. Without healing, you will not grow. The second thing is I had to go to my children, and I had asked my children for forgiveness. And I am blessed to say that they did forgive me. And if you will look to John 1:17. When I went to my children, I sat down with all of them, with both of them, and I just told them, things that I did in my life, how sorry I was, and and I asked their forgiveness because I needed to be a mother. I needed to take care of them. I needed to be their protector. That was my job. My job was to protect my children. That was my job. My job was for my children to have a healthy life. That was my job. And it says here, for the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. You know what? I started to learn who Jesus was with the help of my counselor. I finally, I wasn't quite sure, but I kind of, I knew who God was, but I didn't calculate the fact that there was a person named Jesus. I heard about him, but I didn't commute in my brain what I was talking about. Then the last thing I had to do, I had to go see my abuser. And I went to see him because the Lord told me that you need to forgive him. And if you would go to Matthew 6:14. For if you forgive men their transgressions, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. And when I asked, I apologized. I went and I saw him, and it didn't matter if he heard me or not. It's a matter that I verbally said it. Because when I said it, it set me free. It was free. So I got through forgiveness. I understood what forgiveness was. I understood that there was somebody named Jesus. Didn't quite get it yet, but I understood. I was smart enough to get that. Then after forgiveness and after my therapy, I ended up having a really good job. I ended up moving into my own apartment, and I liked being a mother. And I really got to know my children. My daughter and I were never really close until after I became a single mom. She knew I loved her, but we were not close. She was always a daddy's girl, always. And which was, and he did love her. It's not that he did love her. It's not that he didn't love Jason. It's just that the drugs and his life and the choices in life made him destructive in everything he touched. And after all this was done, then the Lord started to work with me on what salvation was. See, I didn't understand what salvation was. Being a Catholic, the only thing they told you, you went to confession, you went in and went out. I had the same sins over and over again, And I remember going to she was making a confirmation. I went into my first confession where I went and something came out of my mouth. And I looked at that Catholic priest and I said, I know that I'm forgiven for this divorce. I know that I'm forgiven. I know I'm forgiven for my past. And he goes, how do you know? And I said, because when I tried to leave him before, a Catholic priest told me, have you ever sinned? And I said, yes. And he goes, you need to forgive him, and you need to work on this marriage. And I go, and that was a lie. Not every marriage just works out. Mine didn't work out. You know what? God did not intend for women to be abused. That is truth. He intended us to be something. He created us in the image of himself, which you were right about. He did. And that there was greatness in us and who we were. So I had to learn what redemption was. Well, you know, that was a journey for me to understand what redemption was, to understand salvation. You know, like I had the Bible, and I'd open up and I'd read it, but those words did not make sense. They were just words. You know what? And I read it, I thought, I don't get this at all. Like, what? Forget it. You know, it's not working. It's not computing in my brain. So when I finally understood what redemption was, it's in confessing my sins and getting redemption for my sins, because I had to confess my sins to the Lord. He knew it already, but for me to verbally confess it to him, privately, which I did, you know what? I knew that he was there. If you want to turn to Isaiah 44:22. And it says here, we can trust in the redemption without question. For he says in this passage, I have blotted out your transgressions like the cloud, and your sin is like a mist. Return to me, for I have redeemed you. And that made sense. I understood that he redeemed me for all what I had done in my past. And then Ephesians 2:8, it says here, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourself, but it is a gift from God. I understood that forgiveness came from God. Understood that. That started making sense to me. And then everything came to a head in March of 2000. My daughter, in May 22nd of 2000. My daughter was, I had already been remarried again, and my life was really good. And I was going to church, I was growing in Christ, I was understanding, like I was actually reading the Bible, I understood what the Bible was saying, I got it, you know, I started reading, I understood who Jesus was. And then I had to be restored. Well, on that day, my daughter used to be a cheerleader. She was one of these competition cheerleaders, so she was pretty buff. She was not like a tiny, she was a buff girl. She could throw those girls up there and catch them like nobody's business. And we went to California. I got edema, so did she. Mine went away, hers didn't. And we couldn't figure out what was going on with this girl. You know, she didn't date. She never went on dates. You know, she's involved in youth. You know, she was active, productive, everything else. She was a straight-A student. Well, we, on May 22nd, second time, the Lord literally shakes me out of my bed at 5 o'clock in the morning. I think there's an earthquake in Portland, Oregon. And the Lord says, get up and take her in now. So I get up, I get dressed, I wake her up, and I said, hey, you need to get dressed. I said, you better tell me right now. I go, have you ever had sex? Ever? Because I'm going to find out. And she said, and then finally she told me she had sex in October for the first time. And I said, but she had a period every month. Every month this girl had a normal period. Every month. So when I took her in, I talked to the doctor, and I said, she finally told me she had sex, and so he tested her and he found out that yes, she was pregnant. So we rushed her to the hospital, to Legacy. We found out that she was 7.5 months pregnant, the baby was dead, and that she had to give birth. And I thought, oh no, here we go again. So that day, that little girl back there gave birth to a 2.5-pound, 16-inch baby boy, and he was beautiful. And I remember when she was giving birth. I didn't want to look at the baby. And the Lord says, you look at the baby. He said, because he said, I never make a mistake. Everything I make is beautiful. It's my word I use in my ministry, because that's the word he gave me. And I knew when he gave me that word, it'd be for my ministry. And when I looked at that baby and he was born, he was beautiful. And I mean beautiful. He had dark curly hair. He had her shape of her eyes. He had a little tiny nose. He had a little sweet little mouth. And the crazy thing is that, she, of course, had to go through her own emotions and stuff. I felt like I was in a movie because I knew that something was going to take place in my life. I knew it. And she'd hold the baby for a little bit, and they'd put this baby in the freezer to make the baby, from not decaying. But this is the miracle of Jesus. When they brought that baby out for 3 days, he was warm. When he came out of that freezer, warm. And it was like he was a little boy, just a baby, just asleep. And then I called the youth pastor. At that time, his name was Jack Shoemate. He probably thought I was a raving lunatic mother, because I was still a Catholic, by the way, still going to Catholic church, but I was a charismatic Catholic. I was growing. And I told that pastor, I said, you know what? I go, you need to go see my daughter, because she needs to know that God did not forget her, that he has a plan for her.